So both sides of the table is the name of the blog of venture capitalist Mark Suster, because he was also a former entrepreneur and therefore sits on both sides of that table. But both sides of the Atlantic might also be a good name, because Mark left America, came to the UK, created his company here, and sold it to a French company. He then returned back to America, launched another company there, and successfully exited that to Salesforce. He brings an interesting perspective of both the economy and the ecosystem we have here in Europe, but also the one back in the United States. So we've been talking a lot about the sharing economy, and so here's a venture capitalist view of the sharing economy. Please welcome on stage Mark Suster.
Hello, London. Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction. He mentioned that I did live on both sides of the Atlantic. I would also say I've actually lived and worked in 6 countries. I lived in Italy, France, Spain, the UK, Japan, the United States, and set up operations all across Europe. And part of what I'm going to do today is offer some perspectives on the sharing economy on a global basis, because really it is a global movement. And since it's the sharing economy, I'd like to ask you all to take out your mobile phones. And if you look at the top right of the screen, you'll notice my Twitter handle, @msuster. Feel free to share and talk about that you're at the presentation. Remember, #LeWeb. So I thought to myself, after 2 days of zoning out and hearing about the sharing economy, what new could a VC tell you? So what I thought I'd do is give you some perspective on the overall market, from market conditions. Why collaborative consumption? Why now? And importantly, what most people want to know is what next? And of course, I have no idea what next, but that never stopped a VC from telling you. So let me tell you what I see as the real drivers. The real drivers of collaborative consumption are falling prices, expanding network, and a series of economic conditions that are unique to the world in 2013. Unemployment is something that you hear a lot about. The media talks a lot less about underemployment, and underemployment is a very big problem and a very big driver of what we're seeing. Of course, we have a lot of debt, consumer debt, we have government debt, we have globalization is a major driver, scarce resources, food, energy, water. Think about the revolutions around the world in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Iran. And it is no coincidence that these revolutions are happening, popular uprising based on these scarce resources. So I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about that in conjunction with transparency, which is what causes people to realize that that which they don't have, other people have. And of course, about demographic shifts. But I want to point out to you that the sharing economy or collaborative consumption or marketplaces or whatever the F we call it these days, it's not new. In the late 90s, we had, of course, well, throughout the 90s, we had eBay, which is, I guess, the granddaddy of marketplaces. But we also had B2B marketplaces. We had a company called Chemdex. For anyone who was around, Chemdex had $2 million of sales, was publicly traded, and had a market cap of $8 billion. So we've been here before. We've all been excited about it before. Us VCs threw a lot of money at it. Every entrepreneur was creating marketplaces. Every conference, by the way, in the late 90s was all about net markets and marketplaces. So we've seen the hype before, but I believe it's part of a bigger trend, starting with prices. So one of the biggest drivers of internet companies, of the revolution, is deflation. Falling prices. As the graph shows, the value of units and goods over time are decreasing. And when you think about the biggest internet companies are all based on this premise, from Skype to Google, Facebook, Netflix, even newer players like WhatsApp, are driven by the idea that they can disrupt industry through price. And really, when people talk about disruption, they often misquote what disruption actually is. Disruption is driven by three things. Number one, significantly lower prices, usually 90% reduction in prices. Number two, less functionality, less performance than you're used to. And number three, significantly lower margin. And I thought I'd put up a graph that represents this. If you look at the top of the graph, it's the incumbent growth over time of performance and functionality, and the black line on the bottom is the new entrant functionality and performance. You see it significantly less. The red line, importantly, is the customer expectation, the customer requirements of performance. And you'll notice that the red line at time 0 is significantly higher than the new entrant. Now, the reason I point this out is as you think about your business, about your startup, about what you want to create, understand the power of what Clayton Christensen, who coined the term disruptive technology, said: competing with non-consumption. Not competing against incumbents, competing against non-consumption. And what you see over time is performance gets better, functionality gets better, and eventually the entire market trades down to the startup. And this is why, like, the TV industry, Hollywood, can't wrap their head around the power of YouTube. Every executive I see in Hollywood, I'm based in Los Angeles, says to me, yeah, but the quality of the content on YouTube's crap. It's crap because it's not competing with you. It's competing with non-consumption. And by the way, 1 billion users use YouTube every month. 1 divided by 7 billion on the planet uses YouTube every month. 4 billion hours are watched every month. It's the equivalent of every human on the planet watching 150 videos per year on YouTube. And they still don't think it's powerful. I invested in a company called Maker Studios, and if I mention a company, if I don't say I invested in it, I didn't. I invested in Maker Studios. We do 3.4 billion video views a month. We have 25,000 individual video creators, and 250 million people subscribe to our content. When I invest, a lot of people were scratching their head. They said, I don't get it, a YouTube network? Well, of course YouTube is just a distribution platform for us. It just happens to be a freaking large distribution platform. And when you look at the growth of our traffic and of our revenue, it's enormous, driven by disruption. So prices dropping, you need to think about the network. A decade ago, when Chemdex was worth $8 billion, there were less than 400 million people online globally. Now a third of the world is connected. A third of the world's population is connected. And as we know from Mary Meeker's slides, each of these are the biggest internet companies, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and so forth. And what you see in the blue part of the chart is their user base that's non-US. This is a global market opportunity. This slide shows the percentage of literate people who will have smartphones in 4 years' time. 71% of the global population of people who can read will have smartphones in their pocket. And incumbents find it very hard to give up on these juicy margins. So when prices are dropping and networks are going global and the world is connecting, my recommendation is to follow Clayton Christensen's recommendation and compete with non-consumption. The innovator's dilemma, as he called it, is unable to give up the addiction to margin. Economics. This photo is from Spain. Spain famous for protesting jobs and unemployment. I'm going to talk about Spain in a moment. This slide is from the US. The red line is student debt. Student debt in the United States is now $1 trillion. $1 trillion and going up. 100 billion of new debt added per year, which is 2 times on an inflation-adjusted basis what it was just 10 years ago. It's unsustainable. This chart maps unemployment by country. The two biggest countries on the left side of the graph, Greece, Spain. This is youth unemployment. Youth unemployment, this is not underemployment, this is unemployment, north of 50%. An entire generation is at risk of being underutilized. And you think that these conditions are sustainable, high debt, high unemployment? Good luck. The sharing economy isn't new, it's just more urgent, and it is not going away. If you look at the top blue boxes, you had historically trade guilds. These are people who protect jobs, they protect wages. Trade guilds in taxis, in hotels, in gelding, manufacturing. All of this is a form of protectionism that is unsustainable in a market where people need. When you think about universities, yes, it's to educate people, but it's also a form of protectionism for the upper classes to help them sustain high-paying jobs. Or government, when you think about taxation and currency. Why does a phenomenon like Bitcoin emerge? A phenomenon like Bitcoin, we in the Western world don't think about as much. We don't think about hyperinflation or governments that are hostile to our very desires. And if you live in a place like Iran, if you live in some parts of Africa or South America, where governments can create hyperinflation or prevent you from moving assets internationally, who are you going to trust more, your authoritarian government that hasn't served the needs of the people, or a global free marketplace like the internet? And it's not obvious to people, but when you live in countries like that, I think it's more obvious. So when governments can no longer look after their people, people will look out for themselves. My favorite story is an article that was written recently by one of the top trade officials from North Korea. He defected to South Korea. He said his entire life he was brainwashed to only realize that the North Korean government provided everything for the people. And when he got outside of North Korea, he realized, of course, that there's this great world out there. North Korea is in such a desperate state, according to him, on food, that the government can no longer provide for the people. So what do? They tell business, you must provide rice and food for your people. And when you tell business that, and business doesn't have money, what does business do? They trade. They're forced to, in the same way that China was in the Great Leap Forward. And so they trade with their local countries, mostly with China. And what he said in his article was, every North Korean grew up studying the history of their great leaders. Now every person in North Korea knows the main presidents of the United States of America. The currency they're trading, the greenback. And they said what the people need are radios. They need satellite broadcasts. They need to know that this is going out, and the revolution happens from below. In the past, we had forced migration. If you couldn't provide for your own people, you moved. You were mobile. And increasingly, IT-enabled people can tap into global networks of demand rather than move. Of course, we still have to deal with the people who are not tapped into global networks, and they are forced to migrate. But increasingly, there are solutions for people. So I think Thomas Friedman said it best, is the world is flat. And some of the world's most talented people live in countries that can't pay a global market wage. But when global market prices exist, people can tap into those from anywhere in the world. The market sharing economy, this sharing economy we're talking about, is producing new market makers. And we as technologists always ascribe good things to that. We assume everybody's benevolent. But I'm not so sure, will the future marketplaces of the world, not controlled by government organizations, always be benevolent? We have a responsibility, market forces and transparency, and new disruptions to keep them in check. When you think about openness and transparency, radio, television, the telephone, I believe the natural successor to those is Twitter. And I know not everybody's convinced. But the power of Twitter is that it's open. The power of Twitter is giving people information from which to make democratic decisions. Facebook is closed, Twitter is open. And open equals empowerment. But also be aware that openness brings disenfranchisement. That's a mouthful. But disenfranchisement is people who suddenly realize that they live in poverty, but the rest of the world doesn't. It's what causes someone in Tunisia to set themselves on fire. It's what causes people in Egypt to want to rebel against their government, even when it means people are being shot and being killed. And of course, all of this can be mined in real time for business purpose and government purpose. DataSift is a company I invested in. We have a real-time platform that allows you to mine data. For marketplaces, this can be helpful for the things marketplaces need: trust and authority and safety. Being able to mine the historical data of what people have actually said in the past, who's radical, who's not radical, who has a good reputation. We can either trust somebody who tells us what the reputation is, or we can look at empirical data, and platforms like DataSift were born to do just that. So the factors that cause, the different types of marketplaces that exist, I want to explain the clusters that I see. The first is the economics of global. We already talked about this. Comparatively richer countries tapping into amazing resources of comparatively less rich countries from a wage perspective. Odesk is an example of this. Filmmaker is an example of this. Filmmakers can't just pick up from anywhere in the world, from Indonesia, from China, from India, from Japan, and move to Los Angeles to produce films. Filmmaker is an initiative to try and tap into that global talent. DeviantArt. DeviantArt is 30 million registered users, 65 million monthly uniques, 2.5 billion page views. It's the largest art community on the internet. It's the 87th largest website on the internet. Why is DeviantArt growing? Why is it so big? You have a global base of really talented artists who have a hard time making any return for their talent. And then you tap into someone in Tucson or Chattanooga or Leeds who needs graphic design done and can pay a higher wage. The second major cluster is empowering the underemployed. One example of this is dog vacay. Somebody who wants to have their dog and not have them in a kennel when they travel can leave them with another house. And when you think about that, the person who is underemployed can have 5 dogs at their house and earn extra money. Pretty powerful stuff. And of course, it's the major driver behind Airbnb and Lyft and TaskRabbit. The third is moving from hierarchic structures to flat structures. That's what I'm talking about, government. And this example is Lending Club, where you can actually lend to other people who are in need of a loan. Both people benefit, lower costs for the borrower, but hedge funds are now starting to lend directly to customers. Why? Because they're not getting returns on their capital in any other way, and yet there's trust and transparency and data, and they can make predictions about returns, and Lending Club is growing very fast. Of course, in entrepreneurial world, we have AngelList that allows you to tap into angels. The third major type of marketplace that exists is removing physical boundaries. Think about it. When you're a school, a university, and you're a professor, and you can teach to 200 people at one time, your wage is limited by the people in the room. And in the United States is an example where the top institutions are charging $40,000 to $50,000 a year. We're producing all this debt unnecessarily. The internet frees that. As an instructor, you can drive down your costs per instruction, but drive up the network. And I see this happening in a lot of industries. FitOrbit is a company in LA that's trying to do this for personal training. Take Lessons is a company in San Diego trying to create a marketplace for people to provide music lessons. The fourth major area is gains in existing markets to drive efficiency. And these are examples you probably know, StubHub and Uber. They're not fundamentally changing their market, they're making their markets more efficient. Urban Sitter is for babysitters. So I thought I'd ask, come on, what's next? What everybody wants to know. Most markets start with consumers because that's what most entrepreneurs know. But I believe that helping businesses tap into peer networks is going to be the next major thing in collaborative consumption. And I think it stands a chance to be bigger than consumer. I have an example up here from a company called DeLive. DeLive is helping existing retailers and infrastructure providers compete with Amazon. Why? Amazon can beat anyone on price because they don't have physical infrastructure. They don't have to pay for all the stores and the costs and the wages and whatnot. So what DeLive does is they take Uber-like drivers, where they have drivers and logistics and rating system, and they allow drivers to go to a physical store, let's say in the UK Argos, in the US Best Buy, and pick up stuff and deliver it in the same day that you order it for the equivalent cost of overnight delivery. And I think ideas like this will be powerful. So recap, in a world of economic challenges that despite stock markets have not gone away, in a world in which we're globally connected and literate people are all tapped in a world in which prices will continue to drop, the sharing economy, I believe, will thrive for our entire lifetime. And my question is, will you find your place in it? Thank you.
Cool.